It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator, Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting, either through my website, emailrevealer.com. You can just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. If you like our show, be sure and check out our Patreon. All the shows you hear Monday to Friday, AM/FM radio, you can get on Patreon with the commercials cut out. So if you miss a show, you subscribe on Patreon, you never miss a show. Plus, we put a lot of exclusive content up there as well. Our archives are always free. Go to Spreaker.com, and you can find all of our previous shows and do a live show there Friday night, and there's a chat room, and there's you get an email notification when we put up new content. I'm really excited about today's show. The fellow I've known from Twitter, Phillip Crawford Jr., you can find him on Twitter at @byphilcrawford. Also, too, he's got a blog on Phillip Crawford on Medium, and also too on Phillip Crawford Jr. at WordPress. Written several books about gays and the Mafia. One of them is The Mafia and the Gays. Another one is Jersey Queens, Darling and Delightful at the gay bars in the 50s and 60s. And then another one about a wrongful conviction. This is a fascinating one. Railroaded, the homophobic prosecution of Brandon Woodruff for his parents' murder. I've never heard of that one. So Phillip Crawford, are you there?
Yes, hi. Good. Hi, Ed. It's good to be on your show. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've been trying to get you a while, man. I would send you little notes on Twitter saying, hey, can you come on the show? And finally we got you. So tell the audience, who is...
I was glad to.
Yeah, thank you so much. Who is Phillip Crawford Jr.?
Yeah, I'm a retired lawyer. I went to... I grew up in a small town in Maine. Then I ended up going to law school in Washington, D.C., George Washington University. Graduated from there in 1988. Clerked for a couple of federal judges down in D.C. And then by 1990, I ended up in New York City in Manhattan, and I became a practicing lawyer, did a lot of litigation for 15 years, and then retired from the law in about 2005. And made my way into a second career doing true crime writing, primarily focusing on the intersection of crime, organized crime and otherwise, and the gay community. And that kind of led me to my first book, The Mafia and the Gays, which I published in 2015, detailing the historic role of the Mafia in many gay bars throughout the country, particularly in those cities where the Mafia was firmly entrenched, particularly New York City, Chicago, and detailing, their role in many of these gay bars, basically from the repeal of Prohibition in 1933 all the way up through the conviction of Genovese Capo Ganello in New York City in 1985, who was one of the primary, operators of many of these gay bars in New York City at that time.
No, that's fascinating. And I bet a lot of people listening to this are in shock. They're saying these Mafia guys, they would seem so homophobic. They're all racist. They're all homophobes. What would motivate them to be involved in so many gay businesses?
Well, you're right. There's definitely a racist streak within the mob, particularly historically in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and certainly a homophobic streak, with a lot of these guys. But at the end of the day, they're businessmen, and they're primarily motivated by, the almighty dollar. And if they find a chance and an opportunity that's not being served by the market, they'll exploit it and fill that, market void in order to, make their money. And that's why they became so attracted to the gay scene, because, all the way up until, really relatively recently, like the 1970s or so, being gay often was illegal. The gay bars did not become legal until the late 60s. Historically, gay people were persecuted, and the liquor authorities prohibited gay bars and would shut them down. So the mafia had the capacity in order to, service the gay community and pay off the, local police, or the liquor inspectors who would otherwise shut them down. And so they kind of acted as a go-between between the gay community and the officials who would shut them down. In many ways, they acted like at the fourth branch of government, and they kind of, ran the underworld of which gay people were part of at that time. Being gay was illegal.
Now, is this just in New York or across the country?
It was primarily in cities where the mafia was already entrenched. For example, in Chicago or in New York. Along the West Coast, where you had much less of a mafia influence, usually you had just dirty cops or dirty politicians around the gay scene. And in fact, there's a lot of famous stories about, the mafia continuously tried to get into some cities, like, for example, L.A., but, the local authorities just kept them at bay, because they wanted the action. So it was really only in cities where the mafia was firmly entrenched. For example, New Orleans, some gay bars, in New Orleans, some gay bars in Miami, pretty much just where you have your traditional, mafia strongholds.
Now, again, people listening to this will think, well, okay, Mr. Crawford, are you talking about like a piano bar with men in their 50s in suits? or are there some of those more extreme places, like what were the mine shaft and the man, those kind of crazy places?
Well, actually, a lot of different places. The one thing you can say about the mafia is they're very good businessmen. They're hardcore capitalists, and if they and they want to service, their market. As a lot of mobsters will say, hey, all we do is we provide the people what they want. If they want gambling, we'll give them gambling. If they want prostitution, we'll give them prostitution. And if they want gay bars, we'll give them the gay bars. And because you had a lot of different, scenes within the gay community, we're not just one monolithic group. The mafia would kind of, fulfill each niche for the gay community. So they did over the decades at one point or another have some piano bars. And funny that you mentioned the mine shaft, because that actually was a mafia-controlled gay sex club.
Mm. Yeah, but no, I would say it was like 100%. Every gay club in New York City was mafia-controlled, right? Back in the 80s, at least.
No, not 100%.
No?
I mean, in the 60s and the 70s, it was a near monopoly. Probably, well over half of them were mob-controlled or mob-protected. There were so many different ways the mob could exercise its influence. They could have a front person, who they were basically controlling, and behind the scenes, maybe the front person owned 1/3 of the joint, the clean name who nobody, would suspect as being mobbed up. But then the other two, the other hidden partners would be actually mobsters. That is one way the mob would put itself into the gay bar, or they would just, proceed by way of protection. They'd go to a bartender or to a manager or to a bar owner and make them an offer they couldn't refuse. They would kind of say, we want $2,000 a month, and we'll make sure, that nobody raids you, and more importantly, that no rival family will give you any trouble.
Yeah, and then you have to buy your liquor from them. You have to buy your napkins and your laundry cleaning, your linen supply, all that kind of stuff.
The carding service, right. The security at the door, perhaps.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what happened with the Continental Bathhouse, which was a famous, iconic gay institution. Steve Oster opened that up in like 1968 or 1969, and he ended up getting the protection of the Colombo family, and Joe Colombo offered him the protection provided that he used their vending services.
That's interesting too, because now that's pretty much a defunct institution now. But why don't you explain to the audience that it wasn't around in the 70s what the gay bathhouses were?
Yeah, the gay bathhouses and the gay scene was really wild in the 1970s. I mean, it was pretty much a party decade for the entire country, straight people and gay people, and drug use was at its peak, and then it was kind of part of the sexual liberation movement, and so you would have places like the bathhouse where, like at the Continental, they had a swimming pool, private cabins, men running around naked, and pretty much And actually, the Continental was a pretty sophisticated bathhouse. They had a disco, they had a restaurant. It was kind of a full-service social environment for the gay scene, and it attracted a lot of top talent. For example, Bette Midler performed there, and Steve Ostro developed such a close relationship, with Joe Colombo, that he was actually performing the Star Spangled Banner at the Italian American rally when Joe Colombo was shot.
Fascinating. I had no idea about that. So I was also shocked to see in the description of your book here, what is this, the Mafia and the Gays, how even like the Christopher Street Festival and that kind of stuff, they even wormed their way into that and took control over that stuff?
They definitely had an influence. Those organizations that then ran the parade and that at that point ran the Christopher Street Festival, they're no longer in control of those two venues. But at the time, back in the 1970s and the 1980s, the Mafia definitely exercised its influence through a couple of ways. Basically, they were the primary financer of it. Many of the Genovese establishments, finance the parade through the Christopher Street Liberation Day Committee, and then the Christopher Street Festival, which ran the fair, was headed by this character called Ed Murphy. And Ed Murphy had a long history with the Genovese and Gambino crime families, involved in actually some of their, darker, activities, including, child prostitution and child pornography.
Ed Murphy, was he involved with the gay men's health crisis?
No. I don't believe he was.
Who was that guy? Who was the guy that ran gay men's health crisis? Do you know him?
Larry Kramer.
Okay, right, Larry Kramer. Okay. Now, what about that? Was there any kind of organized crime touching that?
No. If the mob was ever going to be afraid of anybody, it would be Larry Kramer and ACLA and GMHC.
And whatever happened to him?
He would send them running. He eventually died of AIDS. Yeah. Larry Kramer.
Yeah, a real heroic character who ran really the only resource for AIDS at all, I think in the whole country at the time. And he ran it out of his little apartment there, into this huge operation.
Yeah. He was a character. He was a firebrand. He actually lived in a Lower Fifth Avenue co-op building, and in that building also lived Mayor Koch, and there are stories about Larry Kramer, coming across Ed Koch, in the hallways or in the lobby, and he would occasionally scream out at him, "Murderer!" Which is ironic since Koch was famously closeted gay man.
Yeah. And also, too, you mentioned Stonewall. Now, I've had guests on this show here who said that one of the reasons why Stonewall was shut down is because there was underage child molestation going on there.
It was shut down. I mean, that what was happening. Ed Murphy was involved with that.
Okay.
He was actually a bouncer at the Stonewall. And in fact, on the night it got raided, and he, was pimping out boys out of the Stonewall, underage boys. And remember, back then, the drinking age was 18, right. And there were just a lot of young people around the Stonewall, including underage folk. And Ed Murphy was just a notorious pederast, and a long sordid history, and there's reputable accounts of him actually, sadly having killed a couple of these people.
Really?
A couple of his kids.
Oh, yeah. Because you don't hear that story about Stonewall. Stonewall is treated like this heroic event, and here you have this stuff going on.
The people were rioting against Ed Murphy.
Okay.
Ed Murphy was not well liked within the gay community because he ran part of the extortion scheme against wealthy gay men at the time. In fact, he had between the mid-1950s and the mid-1960s, he headed a nationwide extortion ring that would basically it was called the Chickens and the Bulls extortion scheme, and he headed it up and would basically use young chicken to seduce older gay men who were in positions of power and wealth, and he would compromise them in order to get whatever they wanted. And that was kind of one of the reasons the NYPD raided the Stonewall, is they believed that some stolen Wall Street bonds were on the premises, that some trader or some executive had been blackmailed into giving the mob. And that's what the NYPD went in there to look for and shut down the place at the same time. But the riots were just as much against the cop raid as it was against the mob owners of the Stonewall.
Incredible. This is all in your book, The Mafia and the Gates. You get into that stuff?
Yeah, it's all in there. And yet I actually, and what's interesting is, Ed Murphy was indicted in 1966, once by the federal authorities, 4 times by Frank Hogan, who was in the Manhattan DA, and Ed Murphy got off scot-free because he ended up cooperating with law enforcement and gave up all the names of all the people who were involved at the street level in the extortion scam. So that saved Ed Murphy from going to jail. But he also didn't get whacked by the mob for ratting everybody out because he didn't disclose any of his mob bosses.
And this is fascinating because now I've also had guests on this show, Richard Kerr, who claims that he was sex trafficked by a Roy Cohen, the attorney from New York City, who was also homosexual, Studio 54 and all that kind of stuff. Have you ever heard any of those? And there's also a rumor of dead bodies on Roy Cohen's property of young boys.
Right.
You've heard this stuff too. You've heard this too.
Well, yes, and I'm going to tell you this. In 1966, when Ed Murphy decided to cooperate with federal and local law enforcement, in 1966 there was a detective in the NYPD. His name was James Rothstein.
Sure.
I've spoken to him several times. He's still alive. He's in his mid-80s at this point. But I've spoken with him several times, and he was Ed Murphy's handler during this time. And the NYPD launched an investigation called Operation GAF, G-A-F-F. And if you want to know what GAF means, just read it backwards. And that's pretty much what it means. But Detective Rothstein's job was basically to do a was to fully debrief Ed Murphy, because what law enforcement was concerned of at that time, they had compromised so many wealthy and powerful people. They want to make sure exactly what had been going on, put the kibosh on the extortion scheme, which they pretty were effective in doing, but find out what did government officials have to worry about. Because you had very high-level political people, military people. There were people who had committed suicide over this. Titans of industry. So in order to do damage control, they had to figure out what was going on, and that's what Detective Rothstein, got to the bottom of. And he spoke with Ed Murphy frequently, and Ed Murphy said, yeah.
Yeah, we've had Jim Rothstein on the show many times, many times. People can go to the archives on Spreaker and just put up Jim Rothstein. It'll come right up at several shows. He also did a lot of work on that Son of Sam cult, too. Do you know anything about that?
No, I don't know a lot about the Son of Sam angle. I know, there's a few people who are very involved in that, but I think it's fair to say is because where that comes from is Detective Rothstein also did another investigation in the 70s, like 74, 75, 76, called Operation Together, and that was when they were trying to figure out, more deeply what was involved with, the mob control over some of these gay bars, what's happening with some of these high-level people who are getting murdered, what's happening to some of these missing young boys that they believed were sex trafficked. And it seemed that some of the boys who were sex trafficked, some of them perhaps may have been feeding into a Yonkers-based, pipeline. And I think that's where the Son of Sam connection comes from. But it's more of a coincidental issue in terms of they were just. I mean, if you're a young sex trafficked kid, you're just a victim. Period. Yeah. And who victimizes you is almost happenstance.
Gotcha. Now, what about are you familiar with a figure named Michael Blutrich? Scores?
I don't know a lot about his story. I know he has the book out there. I think he's actually a gay guy too.
Yeah.
But I don't know a lot about his story. I'm ashamed to say I haven't read the book because I tend to have a more focus range on the relationship between organized crime and historically gay related industries where he was more involved in a very heterosexual enterprise.
Yeah, I hate to say it. The book was really good. I read the book. I had him on the show. The book's really good. But after I had him on the show, we started getting all these phone calls about this guy. People I know were making these allegations against him. And then there was a lawsuit pertaining to that underage boys as well with him.
Right,
and this guy shared an office with the Cuomos.
Right.
He was a Cuomo law partner. I know, no one talks about it. The Cuomo law partner.
Who were they sharing an office with?
Blowtridge was sharing an office with the Cuomo law firm, the Cuomo brothers.
Oh, goodness gracious. Now that you say that, I did know that. I think I did know that.
Yeah. When you walked into the law firm, you went one way, it was the Cuomo law firm. When you went the other way, it was the Scores office. In the same offices.
That's so funny.
Only New York, right? Only New York. If people only knew. Right.
But that's the funny thing about Matty Anello. He controlled so much of the gay scene, basically all the way from 1945, all the way through 1985 when he was convicted. I mean, he just became a giant. But it wasn't like he was some goon, cracking heads on the street. I mean, he operated out of a modern, high-rise office building, on West 50th Street. I think it was like the 18th floor, and it was a whole suite of offices. A law library. He had his finance guy in one office, his lawyer, who was formerly with the Liquor Authority, in another office. I mean, it was a really sophisticated, office operation, and I think sometimes people forget that, organized crime. We aren't just talking about street thugs. I mean, we're talking about very sophisticated, financial, business, enterprise.
Oh, construction companies, labor unions. This is big stuff, man. Big money.
Private loan companies.
Right. And back in those days.
The waste carting businesses.
Well, forget that. Yeah. But back in those days, cement. There was one cement company in New York City. One cement company. I know if you wanted to build something with cement, you had to, I forget what it was. Scaramix, it was called. Scaramix, yeah. Cause I was from Staten Island. After the Bronx, we went to Staten Island, so we brushed up against all those guys.
Yeah, who's that? Who's that? Fat Tony Salerno had a lot of concrete, right?
That's right. Yeah,
I think from the Genovese family.
Right, but Castellano is one way I think owned Scaramix.
All right.
Yeah, I believe. Not that. I mean, by the way, too, when I grew up, we were taught there is no such thing as mafia. How about you? Did you listen to what they taught you to?
well, my mother grew up in Providence, Rhode Island.
Right.
And her girlfriends, apparently had fathers who had connections or two. So I grew up not being told, yes, it was real. Okay.
Yeah. Now, we were talking about the difference about like what you see on TV and what it was really like. And I was just happened to be watching The Sopranos. I binge watched The Sopranos again recently. And they had a whole gay-themed character on there that was based...
Vito.
Right. It was based in real life, right?
Right. Yeah. It was like the character of Vito was, it could have been a composite because there were a lot of different, gay monsters. But most people kind of think it was a composite character, primarily based upon John D'Amato, who was the Cavalcante boss, and he was killed in 1992 by Anthony Capo. And, based upon allegations that, if not gay, the boss was at least bisexual, and Anthony Campos said, we just won't be respected if we have a homosexual boss. But, I'm not so sure that was the primary reason he was actually whacked. Usually anytime somebody gets, whacked in the mafia, it's for multiple reasons, and they may just throw out one reason as the peg to hang their hat on, but at the end of the day, I don't think that's really why he was killed. It may have been a factor that went into their thinking, even assuming it was true, because there's some doubt whether the allegation against him was actually even true, but nevertheless, that was the proffered reason, and it stuck. and God knows it certainly wouldn't help you to be gay in the Mafia. Although there's a fair number of guys in the Mafia, who have been gay, going back decades. But yeah, it tends to be not a good career move.
Yeah, but the thing is, too, I always noticed these guys, they were a little too, especially if there was an openly gay like waiter or something, they were a little too flirty. They were a little too flirty. Like they were kind of like really into it, man. It was just kind of, especially back in the 80s, because it was so, homophobic back in those days. It was just crazy. But now, would we find out? Go ahead.
Well. I understand. Mobs just have this reputation of being homophobic, and they can throw around, the F word as quickly and easily as anyone. But at the end of the day, homosexuality, I think it takes a lot to really offend a mobster.
Right.
And on the scale of things, I just don't think it bothered them that much. They may not have been their thing, and maybe they could, have a tough veneer about it. But at the end of the day, to have a working relationship with one of their principal industry bases, there was some level of respect. And for example, there were reports about Matty Anello. One of the places he controlled was the Gilded Grape, which was a transgender, that back in the day they called it transvestite, or drag queen bar, and apparently he could be kind of flirty with the girls there too.
Yeah.
And most gay people did not have a big problem with the Mafia in the bars. Many of the bars were all the way up into the 1980s when Yanello got convicted. And, you'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of complaints from the gay community about the role of the mob in there, because it just wasn't that big of a deal for them.
That's interesting. And that's also news to me, too, because I always had the impression it was more of an extortion thing, that they were extorting these guys. But I guess they had more of a cooperative relationship.
In some cases, there was definite extortion, and I don't want to downplay that all. In some cases, they were just viciously extorted, and bar owners were just paying off out of fear. And it was, but many of the gay bars were actually owned by the mob. Through gay men even who were fronting for the mob. For example, Seymour Sidon. He was a long time front for the Genovese crime family. He and others made millions of dollars over the year by cooperating with the Mafia and being fronts for them. And they may not be the best employers sometimes. For example, the mine shaft, which was controlled by the Mafia, Michael Umbers was one of the owners of that, and he apparently was close with a Gambino guy named Paul DeBella, who had a long history doing waterfront racketeering, but he also made a pile of money in the gay bars down in the West Village. And one of those that Umbers was involved with was the mine shaft. And the poor manager was a gay guy named Wally Wallace, who basically had the creative concept for the stone wall. He just didn't own any of it. Not the stone wall, for the mine shaft. He just did not own any of it. And then there were reports about Wally Wallace every now and then getting knocked around. So he proceeded with a bit of fear too. So I don't mean to downplay any of that. That's always part of organized crime. There's always that threat of violence, if not actual violence. And so, but by and large, it didn't impact most gay people. If you're just a club goer or a bartender or a bar back, at one of these places, you probably don't have to worry about anything as long as you keep your hand out of the till. And they
refresh my memory, though. The mine shaft was the one they had like an upside down cross that you can go in there and get yourself tied up to.
They probably had just about everything at the mine shaft. Okay. It was over in the meatpacking district.
Right.
It was at
Okay.
835 Washington Street, and it had and it operated, between I believe it was 1979 and 1985 when it was shuttered during the AIDS crisis.
Right.
And it was kind of the creative inspiration for William Friedkin, who did the movie Cruising. And in fact, some of the scenes were taking place in the mine shaft. And actually, for Friedkin to get permission to do filming there, according to Friedkin, he knew Matty Iannello, and he had Matty Iannello intervene to get permission for his film crew to go down there and work.
So they were getting knocked around, but some people went in there intentionally to get knocked around. That's what they were looking for.
Exactly. Yes.
It was part of it.
Well, consent is everything.
Right?
Right?
Right, there you go. Yeah. Now,
Right.
we were talking before about the Cavalcanti family in New Jersey. Is that in your book, Jersey Queens, Darling and Delightful at the Gay Bars in the 50s and 60s?
No, because Jersey Queens basically takes place in the 1950s and the 1960s, based upon liquor authorities released by New Jersey State Attorney General just a couple of years ago, and that basically kind of sets up the regulatory affairs which govern gay bars at that time, how undercover inspectors went in there to shut them down, and more importantly from my angle is how the gay community and the local bar owners united together against the regulatory scheme, which they both saw as interfering with their personal freedoms and their business rights. I mean, they were both pretty anti-government, communities at that time. The bar owners and the gay community, just really resentful of who are these state officials, coming in and telling us what kind of bar we can run, what kind of people we can have in there. And so it's such good primary sources that kind of provide a realistic picture of what the scene was like in the 1950s and 60s. And if the Cavalcanti crime family was involved in any of those joints, I don't know, because I didn't do an analysis of because it's kind of a taxing, procedure to find out which mobs are mob controlled and which ones weren't.
Right.
You have to, get the corporate names. You have to, go through old records, do FOIA requests, and tie it all together. And so I wrote Jersey Queens just to kind of give a feel of what was the culture like. It's kind of a first-person account, from the liquor inspectors about what they observed on these premises.
And what about, you wrote this other book here, Railroaded, the homophobic prosecution of Brandon Woodruff for his parents' murders. What is this story about?
Yeah, this is a really, really tragic story. It involves Brandon Woodruff was a 19-year-old kid going to Abilene Christian University, and he was in the process of coming out. And, he had home one weekend in Texas, and he was the last known person to have seen his parents alive. They were discovered stabbed and shot in the face multiple times, and the Texas investigators, quickly zeroed in on Brandon because he was the last person to see them. But they kind of concocted this whole theory that was not supported by any evidence, that he killed them, in order to get their life insurance policy, in order to pursue his gay life with carefree abandon. And so they just relied upon this really homophobic narrative, and they were saying you can't trust what Brandon Woodruff says because he was lying about his sexuality, because he was being duplicitous with his sexuality, because on the one hand, he was presenting himself as straight to some people, and on the other hand, he was presenting himself as gay to other people. But that's just the nature of the coming out process. And so they took what was an ordinary coming out process and treated it as indicia of guilt, and the problem with that is they had a jury that probably was very willing to embrace that kind of homophobic, argumentation, because 8 out of the 12 jurors expressly stated during the voir dire of the jury that they thought that being gay was immoral. And although they said that certainly would not impact their ability to adjudicate the case impartially, you really just can't uncheck that. I think when you have such a deeply ingrained attitude, it's hard to separate them out. And so there was just so much, and there was very little, if no, evidence that was direct evidence against Brandon. There's no DNA evidence. There's no blood on him. They never found, the murder weapon. And so it's all circumstantial at best. And when you take such weak circumstantial evidence and add on to it a homophobic theory, he was kind of doomed from the start. And by the way, this was in Hunt County, Texas, where the trial happened, which is one of the socially most conservative places in the country. It kind of borders at, that Arkansas, Louisiana area.
Now, have you had a chance to talk to Brandon Dale Woodruff?
I've never spoken with him. We've written before. And I am close with a person who's doing a documentary on the case, and he speaks to him quite frequently.
Any other possible suspects that we could?
I don't know about that. I don't think there's any evidence that points to anybody.
Really?
I think it's one of those cases where, I think the investigative process was so poorly done. There's no evidence that would lead me to point the finger at anybody.
And he went to trial in 2009. So in the United States of America, in 2009, you can come up with this far-fetched fairy tale, with this crazy motive with no evidence, and he got life in prison. What do you get?
He got life in prison without parole. Now it was a capital crime, and so he was eligible for the death penalty. But the prosecutors waived the death penalty, out of consideration to the family because they had already lost, the parents. So the idea of then Brandon being executed, they just want to put the family through that. There was actually a 2020 episode on it about 4 months ago in which I appeared, and they covered the case, pretty well. It was a full 2-hour show.
Now, any chance they'll get a new trial?
That is probably very remote, because he exhausted his appeals. Right. He exhausted his habeas corpus petition in federal court, and his appeal was denied. His habeas corpus petition was denied, and so the only avenue he has now would be a petition to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, in which he can establish 100% his actual innocence. And that's just a tough row to hoe. It's just unless someone else comes forward, with a guilty conscience and says, "I did it," or they find the missing murder weapon or some other physical evidence, with somebody else's DNA on it, that would show it was that person instead of Brandon who did it. He's just really stuck between a rock and a hard place there. And I don't say this lightly. Do I believe he's 100% actually innocent? I'm a big advocate of his. I really believe in his innocence. I certainly believe he did not get a fair trial, and that unfair trial, is likely what got him convicted. But even as someone who believes in him as strongly as I do, who can say 100%? Maybe it's just my nature as a lawyer. I just don't go 100% on anything. It was like I always reserve something back. But I really don't think he did it, and I certainly don't think he got a fair trial. And at the very least, I think that's what he deserves is a fair trial. Where jurors don't. For example. And I don't mean to equate homosexuality and race. I think they're very different. I think, black people have been historically suffered a much greater burden from racism in this country than gay people have from homophobia. So I don't mean to equate the two, but I don't believe we can discount the nature of homophobia in the legal system. And I certainly, don't believe that. If you had a jury in which 8 of the jurors said they were racist, but that won't impact our decision-making process against a black defendant, I think that's reversible error. If you had 8 white supremacists who said we're anti-Semitic, or whatever, but that won't impact our decision-making process against a Jewish defendant. I think that would be a reversible error, and the nature of the homophobia. I mean, because we have to remember, gay people once literally were criminals.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why the Mafia took over, gay bars, for so many decades, because they were providing us with protection against a state that literally wanted to throw us in jail. And for example, in New York State, over the course of a 40-year period, you could arrest, the cops could arrest, they would often, do stings in public restrooms or subway, restrooms or whatever, or in the park or whatever. And they would arrest people, for loitering with, an intent, to commit lewd acts or whatever. They arrested 50,000 people on that charge over a 40-year period. And some of these men literally spent 5 years at Attica, and in Texas in 2003, I think it was, they were arguing to keep, the sodomy statute as a crime, that they could use to prosecute gay men. And so to argue that did not have an impact, on jurors who some of them who were very religious, 8 of whom thought homosexuality was immoral, to argue, and then to say that Brandon was a duplicitous gay man, based upon the coming out process, I just don't see how you could stick him in jail for the rest of his life as a 19-year-old kid, based upon no physical evidence.
Well, that really,
he was the last known person to see him.
19 years old. Now, that really hits, man. 19 years old. And it always, in my head, whenever I do a lot of cases, wrongful convictions, police shootings, all kind of stuff like that, that's right this minute. He's there sitting there in prison right now, right this minute. Like, we can forget about this, turn the radio off and go turn the TV set on the other room, and we're on another dream. But this guy's there every freaking day. And like you said, and if that's the theory of their case, if that's the theory of their motive, their case, you can't have a jury that's prejudiced against the theory of the case, bias.
In ABC 2020, they interviewed Brandon in prison.
Yeah.
And Brandon, when he was 19 years old, he did a little gay porn too. Okay, so he's 19. He's just beginning to hit his peak physicality and everything, and health and looks and all. That was at 19. And in 2005, ABC 2020 interviewed him in prison, and so he said, now what, 35 or something, and look at him in that interview, and he has been aged so badly, well beyond what a 35-year-old. So I mean, it's really taken its toll on him, and he said he's had it pretty lucky. He's never been raped. He's never been in any. I mean, he's in a protective, segregated unit, so that probably helps a little bit. But still, it's a hardcore prison, right?
Yeah.
And so as he says, he thinks his parents, from heaven above, are like angels watching out for him. And his grandmother still supports him and visits him. And so he does still have some support system, and he believes in his innocence too, which I think helps a lot. But still, it's prison.
Yeah. And like you said before, short of someone coming forward with a confession, he has no chance. And there are other cases where people have come forward with a confession, and the prosecution still won't give up the goose there and let it go. And
then the state of Texas is pretty convinced they've got. And this is the one thing I'll say. I mean, I don't want to completely demonize, the law enforcement here, but I do believe law enforcement. I think they have a homophobic blinders on, but I don't believe, there's evil intent. So I want to make sure, they believe they got the right guy. But that's why I believe the jury, shouldn't be allowed to police itself, saying, "Oh no, our homophobic attitudes won't impact, our decision-making process." Because I don't think if you're racist or homophobic or whatever, I don't think you can call it out on your own. I think it's so ingrained sometimes. But he's got a tough road to hoe. And he only has one bite at the apple. So they're working on his petition, on actual innocence, but they want to make sure it's perfect. And, my understanding is they're just not ready yet.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's funny, too, because just last night I was watching that Jeffrey Dahmer thing, too. And those cops there, they were homophobic and return that little boy back to Dahmer. And they actually played the actual recording. I actually talked to one of those cops. He wrote a book about something else. And we had him on the
little Vietnamese boy?
Yes.
Yeah, who had wandered out of the apartment, and he was like, yeah. How old was he? What was he? He was like 14.
Yeah, like 14 years old. Yeah, and they actually said, oh, but you don't understand. It was so busy. There were so many calls. Yeah. Are you kidding me? Like one of the other calls was important to saving some little kid from getting killed. It's just mind-boggling. But now you wrote something about Dahmer too. Something about you felt that the bars he was visiting were.
He was a barfly, man. That's where he was picking them up. He was at a lot of the Milwaukee bars, a lot of popular Milwaukee bars. He was at a lot of the Chicago bars. He even had reportedly he had a membership card to Man's Country, which was one of the big bathhouses back then. So he was totally into the scene, and. It just boggles your mind how. But see, that's a weird thing too. I think these days it's a lot harder to get away with that kind of stuff. But when I would talk to people like Rothstein or one of the police officers he worked with, who I also spoke with, Richard Johnson, on the Operation Together thing. I mean, back in the 70s, for example. When they're trying to investigate, the exploitation, of kids by the Mafia and just predators generally, they were so, the legal system at that point was very ineffectual at giving police officers the tools to actually help them. For example, with prostitution in New York at the time in the 1970s, if you were John. In the likely event you got arrested for soliciting prostitutes or engaging in prostitution activity, then the penalty was the same, whether the prostitute, and I hate to use this word against a kid, but you know what I'm saying, whether the prostitute was a 14-year-old or a 30-year-old, the penalty was the same. And the same thing, with porn back then. You just had a general obscenity law that didn't have an age within it, would have any enhanced penalty. And so as long as, the porn was not considered obscene as a general matter, the age of the participant was irrelevant. And for example, Robert DiBernardo was a Gambino mobster who controlled most of the porn industry and distribution throughout much of America, for goodness sake. He was a huge distributor of child porn, but the cops couldn't get him, and the Fed until like the mid-1980s, because it wasn't until like the early 80s or mid-80s under the Reagan administration they actually finally passed a pornography law that actually prohibited the use of people under the age of 18. That never existed during the 1970s. So unless something was otherwise obscene, the age didn't matter. So if you were a kid who was exploited at that point, there weren't a lot of legal protections for them. So the cops didn't really think about younger victims with the same sensitivity that they do today. They may have treated a 14-year-old girl the same way back then.
It's so,
and I know in New York, in Times Square, they did.
Oh, yeah, so true. And also, too, like you said before, the drinking age was 18. So when we were in high school at 16, we'd go to the bar for lunch. We had 16 years old. And getting shots on your birthday. How old are you? I'm 16. They knew we were from the high school, man.
Yeah, I know. The 70s were crazy.
It really was, man. But yeah. I don't know. And so, Philip, what are you working on next? This is some great content. I really encourage people to get this one here too. This Mafia and the gays. If it covers all this stuff that Rothstein does, I know the audience will love it. But what are you working on next?
I'm doing another true crime book. It's a murder where both the murderer and the victim are both gay. They're both in the early 20s. It happened in the mid 80s. And the victim was blue blood, old storied, waspy family. And the murderer was just kind of this street hustler, kind of real, barely working class, kind of drifter kind of guy who, and just, how homophobia brought their two worlds together, and one got murdered and the other one just recently got executed by the state of Ohio.
Oh, so that's a true story too, then.
Yeah, that's a true story too. Yeah. I tend, and I continue to do investigation into the role of the historic role of the mob and the gay bars and the gay scene. It seems like every time I turn around, the FBI has another 300 pages from somebody's file to give me.
Right.
So that keeps going, and it's just amazing how extensive their control was for since the repeal of prohibition. Up until the conviction of Matty Yanello in 1985, and there's just and I think that I find most compelling about it all is just how sophisticated it was. How the coin-op vendors, the mobbed up ones anyhow, which many of them were, during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They were basically providing the seed money for many of these bars to get up and started. And so they were heavily involved, in many of the bars. And in fact, it came to the point that the state liquor authority sometimes would deny liquor applications based upon what coin-op vendor was providing the financing, because they had flagged them as suspicious because of their alleged mob connections. So, the Mafia investigation kind of takes you through the whole soup to nuts, overview of how the whole racket. It really was a racket for them, a huge racket. They could use the gay bars to launder money. They could use the gay bars to skim profits because they could be cash cows, and that's what got Matty Yanello in trouble was with IRS violations, kind of just like Capone. They got him on skimming. Some of the gay bars would be drug drops because part of the gay community was really into the drug scene. So you could get drugs at some of these bars. So, for example, Anna Genovese, she was the wife of Vito Genovese, and she ran a drag bar in the 1950s called Club 82 down in the East Village on the corner of 2nd Street and 2nd Avenue and 4th Street. And the Bureau of Narcotics had her place scoped out for 6 months because that's where the Genovese, crime family was basically, orchestrating, their heroin trafficking scheme, which ended up putting Vito Genovese behind bars in 1959, and of course where he died in 1969. But a lot of that action happened out of Club 82 in the 1950s. And, so there's just so many components because the mob likes to maximize its assets. Sometimes a gay bar is more than just a gay bar. And they're just so varied in how different they all were. You had leather bars, you had preppy bars, you had professional bars, and you had bars, for street hustlers, and so they really knew their market, in which niche they were trying to attract within the gay community, to try to get them in as customers. And I'm just amazed at how thorough they ran the scene for so many decades.
Incredible stuff. Phillip Crawford, you could find him on Twitter, by Phil Crawford. He's got a WordPress blog, Phillip Crawford Jr. He's also on Medium. What's the Medium one? Phillip Crawford? Medium?
Yeah, Phillip Crawford Jr.
And then you got Mafia and the Gays, Railroaded, and Queer Joints, Wise Guys, and G-Men. As soon as the new book comes out, drop me a line. We'll put you right on the air, my friend. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it, sir.
No, I had a good time. Thank you much.
Thank you, buddy.
Good night.